Atlanta, in the summer of 2004, felt like a furnace with air so thick it clung to every surface and pressed into the lungs of anyone outside. The sidewalks were cracked and baked by a relentless sun shimmering like a mirage that refused to break. On one quiet block sat a small brick duplex with a patchy front yard where the grass fought to stay green. Inside, a ceiling fan spun lazily over a cluttered living room where a television flickered without sound. Denise Bennett stood at the window with her arms folded tight against her chest, staring out at the street she knew too well. She was a nurse who worked nights who had learned to sleep lightly in the day, always listening for her teenage son's voice calling her name. She watched children ride their bikes past her house, and she blinked slowly, trying to remember the last thing Marcus had said before he walked out that door. He had been 16 years old that summer, tall for his age, with lean muscles from playing basketball at the local park every afternoon. Marcus Bennett was the kind of kid who always had a ball in his hand, spinning it on his finger even while talking about homework or helping Denise carry groceries. His friends called him the glue of their group, the one who calmed fights and made jokes that made even the angriest among them crack a smile. He had left the house wearing a faded Atlanta Hawks cap, a crisp white t-shirt and sneakers that he kept cleaner than anything else he owned. Denise remembered hearing the screen door creak as he shouted that he was going to meet the guys at the park, promising to be back before dark. That promise clung to her mind like a cruel joke as days stretched into weeks without a trace of him. When Marcus did not come home that night, Denise assumed he lost track of time. She waited in her chair by the window, dozing lightly and jerking awake at every car passing by. She called his cell phone over and over until the battery died. The next morning, she called the police, her voice shaking in a way that made the dispatcher tell her to calm down. Officers came to her door, took a report with the clinical detachment of men who had seen too many missing kids, too many frantic mothers. They asked about his friends at school, his habits scribbling notes in cheap spiral pads. They did not promise they would find him, but they did tell her to stay hopeful, which felt like another cruel joke delivered with a badge and a practiced frown. Denise felt the weight of every minute that passed, an endless echo of what-ifs filling her small living room. At the basketball court, where Marcus was last seen, the backboard rattled in the wind. His sneakers were found lined up neatly on a cracked bench side by side as if waiting for him to come back and slip them on. That detail haunted Denise in her sleep, making her wake up gasping in the middle of the night. She could see those shoes in her mind so clearly that she could describe every scuff on the sole to anyone who would listen. A kid at the park said he saw Marcus get into a black car with tinted windows, but he did not see the license plate. The police shrugged when they heard this, telling her it could have been anyone. No camera caught it because the nearest security camera had malfunctioned that week. Denise tried to understand how a city so big could have so many blind spots exactly when she needed clarity. As the sun kept rising and setting over Atlanta, the flyers Denise taped to light poles began to fade and peel. Rain smudged the ink on the ones she nailed to neighborhood bulletin boards, the colors bleeding down like tears. She kept replacing them, printing new copies late at night at the nursing station during breaks. She handed them to neighbors who took them with awkward nods to store owners who taped them in dusty windows. She searched the streets herself when she was not working, stopping at bus stops and convenience stores to ask clerks and strangers if they remembered seeing a boy with a Hawks cap. Some said yes, some said no, most just shook their heads politely. Her hope became something brittle and dangerous, something that cracked with every polite lie people told to comfort her. Denise watched her neighborhood change while she searched. New construction went up where the old laundromat had burned down. A new grocery store replaced the mom-and-pop corner shop where Marcus used to buy sodas after school. She noticed new faces and lost track of old ones. Time kept moving for everyone else while hers stayed frozen on the moment her son walked out the door. She would sometimes sit in the park alone at dusk, the squeak of rusty swings and the thump of basketballs on concrete filling the heavy air. She looked at the empty bench where his sneakers had been found, and she felt the ache in her bones and her teeth in her skull. It was a grief that had nowhere to go, so it lived inside her, settling in every part of her, until she no longer knew how to be anyone but a mother searching for her missing child. Denise could not understand how the world kept turning without Marcus in it. She hated the casual cruelty of normal days, the way the mail kept arriving, the way people complained about traffic and bills. She kept the house just as he left it, his bedroom door cracked open so she could see the glow-in-the-dark stars he stuck to the ceiling years ago. She kept his favorite cereal in the cupboard even though it went stale, and she had to throw it out every few months. She kept his phone on her nightstand, the battery long dead, but sometimes she pressed the button hoping it might buzz to life. In her dreams, she heard his voice not calling for help, but laughing, asking her to hurry up so that they would not be late. She woke up crying, the salt on her lips, the only evidence left that he had ever been there at all. The police launched the official search the next morning, while the humid Georgia air pressed down like a warning. Officers in pressed blue shirts went door to door, asking neighbors the same questions Denise had asked the night before, but with less desperation in their voices. She watched them from her porch as they scrawled notes on cheap notepads, and nodded solemnly at everyone who claimed to have seen nothing. A cruiser idled at the curb with its lights off and its engine humming like a patient predator. Denise felt her stomach twist with each passing hour. She could not understand why they moved so slowly. Every moment without Marcus felt like another mile he was being taken away from her. She tried to hold on to hope, but it was as slippery as sweat on her palms. She had no idea how long she could pretend she was strong enough to keep looking at the blank faces of people who wanted to believe nothing bad could happen in their neighborhood. They organized volunteers to walk the alleys and parks with flashlights after sunset. Denise joined them, clutching a borrowed lamp that flickered with dying batteries. She followed the police captain who mumbled orders and waved at the clumps of neighbors holding coffee cups and cell phones. They rustled through bushes and kicked over trash cans but found nothing but broken bottles and dead leaves. Denise imagined Marcus tied up in some dark basement while they wasted time here. She yelled his name so loud her voice cracked, and the captain gently told her to calm down. No one said it, but they all thought it was unlikely they would find him tonight. By 2 a.m, the volunteers drifted away one by one, until only Denise remained in the park alone. She sat on the bench where his shoes had been feeling the night press in on her. The following day, police dogs were brought in from another county. Their black fur glistened in the sun as they sniffed along the bus stops and park trails. Denise held her breath each time they hesitated, hoping they caught something, anything. The handlers spoke in quiet monotones to the animals, while cameras flashed from local news vans. Reporters stuck microphones in her face and asked how she was holding up. She wanted to scream at them, but she simply turned her back and listened to the dogs pant in the grass. The officers told her the dogs lost the trail at the main bus stop, suggesting Marcus might have boarded a bus heading downtown. That single sentence rang in her ears with dread because it was the first real lead, but also the first proof that he might be so far away she could never reach him. She pressed the transit company for surveillance footage. They told her there was none. A storm had knocked out power to the cameras the week Marcus vanished. The timing felt so cruelly precise that Denise felt bile rise in her throat. She wondered if God was testing her or punishing her for something she could not remember. The officers shrugged apologetically when she demanded they check the bus drivers who worked that route. They interviewed a few but found nothing useful. One driver said he remembered a kid who might have matched Marcus's description, but he had been half asleep during his break and could not be sure. Another insisted no one that age had boarded at all. It felt like Marcus had disappeared between heartbeats evaporated into the hot Atlanta air without leaving so much as a footprint. Days bled into weeks, and the posters Denise made began to sag on telephone poles, the ink running, when afternoon storms soaked the city. She replaced them, constantly carrying rolls of tape in her purse like a weapon she could wield against forgetting. She left stacks at gas stations, libraries, and laundromats, and she stuck them in the hands of anyone willing to listen for half a minute. Neighbors stopped answering the door when she knocked, their pity drying up like the summer rain. She felt herself hollow out from the inside, a walking husk that went through the motions of work and sleep. She forced herself to eat in front of coworkers so they would not worry, but food felt like clay in her mouth. The police presence in her neighborhood shrank slowly but surely. Patrol cars stopped making rounds in the park. Detectives stopped calling with updates. The case file sat on someone's cluttered desk gathering dust while Denise waited for them to do something. She called the station every day at first, and then every week, her voice cracking with hope that someone would answer with news. The response became an exhausted promise to let her know if anything changed. Nothing changed. She was left to roam the city with her homemade flyers and a voice that no one wanted to hear anymore. She noticed the way clerks and neighbors avoided her eyes. She understood she had become the symbol of something they wanted to forget. The calendar pages in Denise's kitchen seemed to turn without her noticing. Holidays passed in silence while the city moved on, glittering with lights in December and sweating through another July. She marked the days Marcus had been gone on the wall beside the fridge until there were so many black lines it looked like a prison. She no longer found comfort in routine. Going to work as a nurse felt like betrayal because she knew she should be searching for her son. Co-workers avoided bringing up his name, afraid of the way her eyes hardened or watered when they spoke too kindly. She felt herself become smaller and quieter, and at night she would sit on the edge of her bed listening to cars in the distance, wondering if he was in one of them screaming for help where no one could hear. She told herself she would keep looking, but her body betrayed her with fatigue so deep she could not stand some mornings. Police stopped returning her calls with any sense of urgency. The detective assigned to Marcus's case rotated out and was replaced by another who barely pretended to care. She sat in the station lobby for hours on end, listening to the buzz of old computers and the tired voices of officers telling people to take a seat. They spoke to her with pity that felt like poison. They said the case had gone cold, that they were still accepting tips, but resources were limited. She heard the truth in their voices even when they tried to hide it. Marcus had become just another file in a cabinet, one more face on a fading poster in a precinct hallway. Denise felt the sting of betrayal in every apology they offered. She went home with the weight of those words pressing into her ribs until it hurt to breathe. Denise did not stop trying. She took to the bus routes herself, sitting near the back, and watching passengers shuffle on and off, memorizing faces and details in a feverish need to catch something everyone else missed. She asked drivers if they remembered that day in June, hoping one of them would see her grief and confess a forgotten memory. Most shook their heads and apologized, their eyes sliding away from hers. She rode buses through neighborhoods she would not have walked alone, clutching her purse and glancing at every street corner. She kept telling herself she would know him even after all this time. She would see his walk, the tilt of his head, the way he rubbed his knuckles when he was nervous. She waited for those signs, but all she found were strangers who looked away when they felt her stare. Tips that came in were crueler than silence. Someone claimed they saw him in a gang fight downtown, another said he had been dealing drugs on the west side. Denise forced herself to investigate every rumor even when she knew in her bones they were lies. She talked to kids who laughed in her face or rolled their eyes, telling her they never heard of Marcus. She went to the police with these tips only to see them nod, slowly promising to check it out, knowing full well they would not. She once heard two officers mutter that Marcus probably ran away. She had to leave the building before she screamed at them. She told herself she would not let them forget her son's name, but some days she wondered if anyone remembered it but her. Time played tricks on her. Some days she woke up convinced she had heard his voice in the house calling for breakfast the way he used to. She would rush to the kitchen only to find silence and a cold stove. She kept his room exactly as he left it, the bed unmade school papers scattered on the desk, and his basketball tucked into the corner. Dust collected on the windowsill, but she could not bring herself to clean it. She felt like cleaning would be admitting he was never coming back. She sat on his bed at night, whispering apologies for letting them close his case, for not being strong enough to make them keep looking. She prayed even though she did not believe anyone was listening. Friends stopped visiting. They said they did not know what to say anymore, that they wanted to give her space. Denise understood that space was just another word for absence. She felt it when the church stopped mentioning his name during services when neighbors crossed the street to avoid running into her. She understood the polite cruelty of people who wanted her tragedy to be over so they could go back to normal. She learned to be silent at family gatherings, nodding politely when someone offered forced optimism. She saved her screaming for the moments alone in her car, hitting the steering wheel until her palms bruised. She felt herself become the ghost of the woman she used to be, inhabiting the same skin, but hollowed out by grief that refused to let go. Denise found herself staring at the ceiling late at night, while the slow click of the old fan marked time she could not get back. She refused to accept that her son was gone forever. Even when exhaustion made her bones feel like lead, she forced herself to plan the next day. She filled notebooks with names of people to call and addresses of places to check. She kept records of every conversation with police, no matter how brief. She learned the names of city council members and sent letters that went unanswered. She pressed flyers into the hands of anyone who did not turn away fast enough. She became relentless because the alternative was to sit still and let Marcus's memory fade completely from the world. She no longer cared about polite conversation or keeping her voice calm. If someone suggested she move on, she cut them off mid-sentence and walked away. Her search led her to the people Marcus had known best. She visited his school, where the principal met her with a sympathetic smile and told her how sorry they all were. Denise felt anger bubble in her chest at the past tense in his words. She found a few of Marcus's friends willing to talk, their voices hesitant as they shared small details they had held back from police. One boy remembered Marcus arguing with an older man behind the basketball court. Another admitted Marcus seemed worried that last week and had mentioned wanting to avoid someone named Reggie. Denise wrote everything down carefully, even when her fingers shook. She repeated the names like prayers under her breath. These scraps of memory became her only clues. She could not let them slip away, even if they led her into places she did not want to go. Denise tracked down Reggie Miles by asking around in the neighborhood. She found his mother, first a weary woman who refused to look her in the eye. Denise kept her voice level as she explained why she needed to know where Reggie was. The woman finally told her Reggie was dead. He had been murdered 6 months after Marcus vanished. The news hit Denise like a physical blow. She staggered back a step, clutching the flyer she had tried to hand over. She wanted to ask more, but the door closed in her face with a soft finality. Denise stood on the stoop for several minutes, trying to steady her breathing. The street around her blurred with the hot shimmer of summer. She forced herself to walk away, even though her legs felt like they would buckle. That night, she spread out all her notes on the kitchen table. The worn wood was covered with names circled in red ink and arrows connecting events she no longer trusted her memory to hold. She stared at Reggie's name and the single fact of his death. It felt like the answer to a riddle she did not yet understand. She wrote and rewrote questions she would never get to ask him. She felt bitterness twist in her chest at the thought that Marcus's only lead was buried in the same dirt he might be lying under. She told herself she would not stop just because one door had closed. She had seen too many doors slam shut already. She forced herself to make a new plan, even though hope felt like a cruel game played by someone who did not care about mothers like her. In the weeks that followed, Denise haunted police headquarters with new information. She sat in front of detectives with her notes laid out like evidence at trial. She watched their faces change from polite interest to guarded distance as she spoke Reggie's name. They admitted they knew about him, but dismissed the connection as a coincidence. She felt rage boil up, but forced herself to keep her voice even. She repeated every detail she had gathered, daring them to ignore it to her face. They promised to check into it, but she could see the lie in their eyes. She left the station shaking with fury and shame, disgusted that she had to beg them to care. She walked to the bus stop and sat with her hands clenched in her lap, listening to the wind rattle trash against the curb. Denise continued her private investigation by talking to people who avoided the police. She visited late-night diners and convenience stores where teenagers hung out and asked quiet questions over cold coffee. She listened to rumors that twisted with every retelling but wrote them down all the same. She learned about fights and debts and small-time drug deal that stained the neighborhood with fear. She accepted that the world her son lived in was more dangerous than she had wanted to believe. She stopped flinching at ugly truths. She told herself she needed to know everything, even if it made her hate the ground she walked on. She refused to let shame or fear keep her from asking. She refused to pretend she was not capable of going anywhere or talking to anyone if it meant one more clue. 8 years after Marcus vanished, the seasons turned as they always did, but Denise felt nothing change inside her. She woke to the same weight in her chest and the same heavy silence in his room. Her hands were older now, lined and dry from too many hospital shifts and too many nights spent clenching them in worry. She had given up on the police years before and turned instead to her own rituals of searching and waiting. She talked to fewer people now, but still kept a stack of flyers in a drawer ready to hand out. She spoke to Marcus in quiet moments as if he sat beside her listening. She reminded him she had not forgotten, even if everyone else had. She lived with the quiet certainty that she would never stop, even if it killed her. One morning, in late summer, she sat at the kitchen table, sifting through unpaid bills when the local news droned in the background. Her eyes glazed over at the familiar string of crime reports and city council arguments until a single phrase made her lift her head. An abandoned city bus in Decatur had been stripped for parts, and workers had found personal belongings inside. She turned up the volume, leaning in with her breath caught in her throat. The reporter mentioned a cap with the Atlanta Hawks logo stuffed under the last row of seats. Denise felt her vision narrow to a tunnel of disbelief. Her hand trembled as she grabbed her phone to call the number on the screen. She forced the words past her dry mouth, praying someone would listen this time. The bus had sat in a salvage yard for years, baking in the Georgia sun and rusting at the seams. It was covered in graffiti and the smell of mildew clung to its seats like rot. When Denise arrived, she was met by a young officer who seemed uncomfortable with her urgency. She demanded to see the cap, but was told it was being processed as evidence. She felt tears prick her eyes at the word evidence because it sounded so official, so cold. She showed them old photos of Marcus wearing the same cap tilted at the same angle with the brim worn soft at the edges. The officer shifted from foot to foot and promised to tell the detectives. Denise insisted on waiting there in the heat until someone would talk to her. She refused to let them dismiss her this time. When they finally let her see it behind glass, her knees buckled. It was unmistakable to her, even with the dirt and faded colors. She pressed her hand to the glass, imagining Marcus pulling it low over his eyes to block the sun. Forensic tests confirmed what she had already known in her heart. The blood inside the sweatband matched Marcus's DNA. The news settled on her chest like a weight, but also like proof she had not been wrong all those years. She had not been the hysterical mother the police had treated her as. She wanted to scream at them that she had been right. Instead, she closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing so she would not fall apart in front of the strangers taking notes. The discovery of the cap forced the police to reopen the case, but Denise refused to celebrate. She had seen before how quickly their interest faded when leads dried up. She sat across from new detectives who asked her the same tired questions with slightly different wording. She answered them because she had to. She handed over her notes, which were worn thin from years of folding and unfolding. She pointed to Reggie's name and watched them scribble it down without promise of follow-up. She wanted to believe this time would be different because there was physical evidence, but the skepticism in their eyes had not changed. She had to fight the urge to snatch her papers back and storm out. The police began pulling bus records from that day so long ago. They discovered the route had been diverted because of a protest downtown, causing the bus to pass through an industrial area filled with warehouses. Denise listened to them explain it as if it were new information, even though she had memorized every bus schedule years ago. The detail made her chest tighten. She imagined Marcus sitting in that bus, watching buildings blur past dirty windows, not knowing it would be the last ride he ever took. She tried to picture what he had felt, whether he had been afraid or defiant or simply tired. She pressed her fingers into her palms until they hurt, trying to stay present so she could catch every word. Another piece of information surfaced that sent a chill down her spine. On the same night Marcus went missing, another teenager had been reported missing from a nearby neighborhood. That boy's body had been found 2 days later in an alley, a mile from one of those warehouses. The police mentioned it casually, as if it were only another data point, but Denise felt her stomach flip. She asked them if they had ever compared the cases, if they had looked for connections. The detectives exchanged looks and promised to check. She left the station with a headache pounding behind her eyes. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, feeling a rage so complete she could not move. When police confirmed the blood on Marcus's cap, Denise felt a wave of vindication that turned immediately to grief. She sat in the station conference room across from detectives who finally addressed her with a new level of seriousness. The stale air smelled of burnt coffee and sweat. The lead investigator flipped through a thick folder filled with maps and photos and described how the bus route had been diverted due to a protest that clogged downtown traffic. Marcus would have been forced through a district of old industrial warehouses, long since abandoned or repurposed for storage. Denise listened while her heart raced at the mention of that area because she had always feared those dark, silent buildings. She imagined Marcus pressed against the dirty window as graffiti-covered walls slipped past in the evening gloom. She felt certain he knew something was wrong even before he stepped off. Detectives asked her again for every detail she could remember from that week. She repeated the same timeline she had committed to memory so long ago that it felt like reciting a prayer. She remembered what he wore the day he left the house and the sound of the screen door slamming. She described the arguments he had with her about staying out too late and the way he always promised to be back before dark. She spoke of his friends and the rumors she had chased down herself years before. Her voice trembled when she told them about Reggie Miles and how she had found out he was murdered. The detectives nodded and scribbled in their notebooks, but Denise saw their faces shift when she mentioned Reggie's death. They no longer looked skeptical. Instead, they looked wary, as if the edges of the case were sharpening into something they could not easily ignore. The police turned their attention to the bus records from that night. They managed to locate old dispatch logs and driver schedules that had survived in boxes in the Transit Authority basement. It turned out the driver on Marcus's route had retired and moved out of state. Detectives tracked him down for a phone interview. Denise sat at the edge of her chair as the lead investigator recounted what they learned. The driver claimed he remembered the protest and the chaos of the rerouted passengers. He admitted he had taken a break near the warehouse district that evening to smoke and use the restroom. When pressed, he confessed that he saw a group of older boys hanging around the back of the bus and said he had a bad feeling. But when asked why he did not mention this before, he grew quiet. He claimed he was never asked in detail and did not want to get involved with the police at the time. Denise felt her blood boil listening to this revelation. She pressed her palms against the table, trying to steady her breathing. She asked the detectives if they believed him. The lead investigator leaned back and admitted they were checking his story against the records, but he sounded frustrated too. Denise could tell this was the first real break they had in years, and they were scrambling to catch up. She found no comfort in being right. Instead, she felt anger and sorrow twist together until it was hard to tell them apart. She thought of Marcus sitting on that bus while the driver stepped outside, leaving him vulnerable in the dark with men waiting nearby. She closed her eyes and pictured her son realizing too late that no one would help him. Police started examining the warehouse district where the bus had stopped that night. Decades of graffiti and weather had stripped the buildings of any charm they once had. Windows were boarded up or shattered, and weeds grew through the cracked asphalt. Denise watched from a distance as uniformed officers and crime scene techs moved through the hollow shells of buildings. She felt cold even in the Georgia heat. She had walked those streets herself years ago, handing out flyers to anyone who would take them. She remembered the way people looked away from her as if she carried something contagious. Now, the police picked over the ground with measured steps, hoping for anything that could still be found after so many years. She wanted to shout at them to hurry because the ghosts had waited long enough. One morning, the lead investigator called Denise personally. His voice was tired but respectful. He told her they had found graffiti inside one of the warehouses. Denise gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. The paint was faded and layered over in places, but part of it read MB. It was Marcus's nickname, something he had scrawled on notebooks and basketballs. Denise felt her legs give way and she sank into her chair sobbing. The investigator let her cry before he spoke again. They had also found dried stains on the floor near the back entrance. Initial tests suggested it was human blood, though degraded by time and exposure. Denise listened in silence as he explained they would need more testing to confirm anything. Detectives arranged for Denise to visit the warehouse district under controlled conditions. She sat in the back of a cruiser watching Atlanta blur by the window while her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might crack her ribs. The car stopped in front of a sagging building whose bricks were covered in overlapping graffiti. The roof sagged in places where the weather had eaten away at the structure. Denise stepped out into the thick humidity and stared at the building that had haunted her dreams. She could not shake the feeling that Marcus had seen these walls last. She braced herself as officers guided her carefully over broken concrete and splintered wood. The smell of mildew and old oil was strong enough to make her gag. She forced herself to keep going because she owed Marcus that much. Inside the warehouse, light slanted in through broken windows and pale lines that illuminated dust motes dancing in the stale air. The floor was littered with trash, discarded needles, and shards of glass that crunched under boots. Denise felt the sweat trickle down her back as she approached the rear entrance. There, on the crumbling brick wall, the initials MB had been painted in faded black. Layers of spray paint covered parts of it, but she could make out enough. Her fingers trembled as she reached out but did not touch it. She whispered his name softly, though no one responded. Nearby technicians photographed what looked like old bloodstains on the floor. She felt bile rise in her throat at the idea that Marcus had bled here while no one knew or cared. She closed her eyes and listened to the creaks of the building, willing herself not to scream. Officers stepped carefully around the room, documenting everything, marking out lines with yellow tape. Denise watched them set up their equipment with a clinical detachment that both comforted and enraged her. She wanted to be grateful they were finally doing the work, but the delay felt unforgivable. A crime scene analyst explained they would take samples from the floor for lab testing, but warned that the age and condition of the building meant results might be limited. Denise nodded mutely, accepting the cold facts while her heart twisted in her chest. She remembered begging detectives to search this area years ago only to be dismissed. The knowledge that Marcus might have been dying here while she was hanging flyers felt like a knife between her ribs. She turned away and covered her mouth, trying to hold back sobs. They found other unsettling evidence as they moved through the warehouse. Piles of old mattresses, broken chairs, and beer cans suggested the place had once been a hangout for older teenagers and vagrants. Denise tried not to imagine what might have happened here on that summer night. She listened as detectives speculated quietly about local gang symbols sprayed on other walls. The graffiti told a story no one had cared to read. One officer took photos of symbols they believed tied to a group known for recruiting young boys and using violence to control them. Denise felt ice in her veins as she realized Marcus might have been lured or forced here as part of something far more organized than anyone had admitted. She pressed her nails into her palms until they left red crescents in her skin. Detectives made calls from the scene to follow up on old records. Denise overheard one mention the name Reggie Miles, and she felt her ears burn. She stepped closer as they discussed the possibility that Reggie had been involved in bringing kids into the gang before he was murdered himself. The pieces lined up in Denise's head in a way that made her dizzy. Reggie's death had once been treated as unrelated, But now the officers spoke of it as if it might have been a silencing. She wanted to shout that she had told them all of this years ago, but her voice caught in her throat. She felt the familiar helpless fury burn inside her, but all she could do was watch them take notes and mark evidence. Outside the warehouse, Denise stood in the sunlight trying to catch her breath. The heat pressed on her like a weight, but she did not move to shade. She stared at the boarded-up buildings lining the street and wondered how many other secrets they held. Officers milled about behind her, coordinating the next steps. She heard talk of contacting families of other missing teens and checking the area for remains. The words felt surreal in their calm delivery. Denise knew the odds were slim of finding anything so many years later, but the fact that they were even saying those words felt like a cruel vindication. She wiped sweat from her forehead with a shaking hand and forced herself not to fall to her knees on the hot asphalt. Denise left the warehouse district with her mind burning with unanswered questions. She sat at her kitchen table that night with her notes spread out before her, illuminated by the dim light of a flickering lamp. The old paper was marked with names and dates arrows, pointing in every direction like a map of her obsession. She traced her fingers over the name Reggie Miles, remembering the door that had slammed in her face when she tried to talk to his family. She felt the bitterness rise, but forced it back down. She would not stop now. She picked up her phone and began calling the last contacts she had from those old conversations, her voice even and steady despite the tremor in her chest. She asked questions with the calm persistence of someone who refused to be ignored any longer. Days turned into weeks as Denise visited blocks where the police rarely lingered. She spoke to shop owners, old classmates of Marcus, and anyone who might have known Reggie. She sat in cramped kitchens and on concrete stoops listening to stories that twisted with age and fear. Slowly, a pattern emerged. She heard about how Reggie used to hang around the warehouse district, not just partying, but meeting older men who paid him to find young recruits. She listened without interrupting, though her stomach clenched at every new detail. The people she talked to looked at the floor or out windows, reluctant to say too much, but the truth was there in their lowered voices and nervous glances. Denise wrote it all down with careful precision, determined that none of it would be lost this time. One name kept surfacing in those whispered conversations. It belonged to a former bus driver who had worked the area for decades and had retired soon after Marcus vanished. Denise tracked him down through public records and found him living in a rundown house in a quiet suburb. She knocked on his door with a trembling fist and waited, clutching her notebook so tightly her knuckles whitened. When he answered, she introduced herself, calmly explaining why she had come. At first he tried to close the door, but she held it open with her foot and begged him to listen. Her voice cracked only once as she described Marcus's smile and the cap they had found in the bus. She watched his eyes shift as he considered her words. Finally, with a defeated sigh, he let her in. Inside his cluttered living room, the air smelled of old coffee and dust. He lowered himself into a sagging chair and stared at the floor. Denise perched on the edge of the sofa, notebook open in her lap pen, ready. He spoke haltingly at first, admitting he had been on break the night Marcus vanished. He described seeing Marcus on his bus and remembered the protest that forced the detour. Denise held her breath as he confessed to seeing two older men pulling Marcus off the bus while he smoked behind the depot. He claimed he felt frozen with fear, afraid to intervene or call for help. He told her one of the men had something clipped to his belt that looked like a badge. Denise felt her heart lurch. She asked him to repeat that detail twice, her pen scratching furiously as he spoke. The old man looked ashamed when he finished. He told her he never reported it because he was scared of retaliation. He had children of his own at the time. Denise sat in silence for several long seconds as anger and sorrow roared in her ears. She thanked him, finally her voice brittle. She stood and left without looking back, feeling the sun blind her as she stepped outside. She walked to her car on unsteady legs and sat in the driver's seat, shaking. She laid her forehead against the steering wheel and wept until she had no tears left. When she sat up again, she felt something cold and steady settle in her chest. She started the car and drove straight to the police station. At the station, Denise asked for the lead investigator by name. When they tried to stall her, she raised her voice until heads turned. She handed over her notes with every detail of her conversation, daring them to ignore her now. She described the badge, the fear the confession of a witness who had stayed silent for nearly a decade. The detective read her notes carefully without interrupting. For the first time in years, Denise felt like someone was truly listening. They asked her to sit while they made calls. She waited for hours in that lobby, watching officers pass her by with quick glances. She held her purse on her lap with both hands and refused to move until someone told her what would happen next. Detectives reviewed Denise's notes and questioned the retired bus driver themselves. His account remained consistent, though he trembled through every word, pale and drawn. He described the two men as older one, heavyset with a scar on his jaw, the other lean with close-cropped hair. Most chilling was his memory of the metallic badge clipped to the belt of the lean man. Denise sat outside the interview room listening to muted voices pressing her hand against her chest to calm her breathing. She watched the hallway clock tick forward, knowing every second felt stolen from the years she lost with Marcus. When the door opened, an officer beckoned her in. She stood slowly, legs stiff from waiting, and entered the sterile room filled with the smell of stale coffee and floor cleaner. The lead detective met her eyes with a solemn expression. He explained carefully, words chosen with deliberate care, that the department had once received rumors about a group of off-duty officers who took it upon themselves to clear gang influences from certain neighborhoods. They had no formal authority, no official mandate, and their actions were never documented in any report. They simply existed as whispers among older officers, a ghost of a time when policing blurred lines no one wanted to see. Denise felt her mouth go dry as he spoke. She gripped the arm of her chair until her knuckles went white. He told her that no one had ever proved this group existed, but he had personally heard veterans speak about intimidating suspected gang recruits to scare them straight. Denise struggled to speak as the room seemed to shrink around her. She managed to ask one question in a strained voice. Was Marcus ever on any watch list? The detective hesitated before shaking his head. Officially, Marcus was never flagged. He explained it was likely Marcus had argued with Reggie Miles, whose name was known to them. That simple connection might have placed Marcus in the crosshairs of a group operating off the books. Denise felt heat rise behind her eyes, a dull roar in her ears. She clenched her teeth so hard her jaw ached. She saw her son's face in her mind, wide-eyed and determined, insisting he would be home before dark. The detective cleared his throat and told her they would review every old lead dig through retired personnel files and see if anything pointed to who those men might have been. Denise left the station feeling like her body weighed twice as much as before. The city outside seemed unchanged: cars, honking at intersections, people talking on corners, oblivious to the revelation that had shattered her. She walked slowly to her car, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel without starting it. She watched people move on with their lives and wondered if they had any idea how easily the world swallowed a child. She pressed her forehead to the steering wheel, tears leaking onto her jeans. She whispered Marcus's name over and over like a prayer. She remembered the way he always made sure to call if he was running late, how he liked his cereal too sweet, how he left his socks in the living room despite her scolding. She dug her nails into her palms until they left angry red crescents. In the following weeks, police followed up on the lead Denise had forced into their hands. They interviewed old officers, many retired to other states. Some denied knowing anything. A few, caught off guard, admitted there had once been talk of cleaning up corners, but they remembered nothing specific. Denise sat in on meetings when they let her watching faces carefully. She noticed who looked away first. The lead detective shared updates sparingly, but promised her they were not shelving the case. They cross-checked old logs, patrol assignments, and training rosters looking for the men described by the bus driver. Denise felt hope flare and sputter like a dying candle. She had lived too long on false starts to let herself believe anything would truly change. Newspapers picked up the story when the department announced it was re-examining Marcus's disappearance in light of potential misconduct. Denise found herself standing in front of microphones outside the station, sweat soaking through her blouse in the Georgia heat. She spoke with steady rage about a boy who deserved to grow up, who loved basketball and wanted to be an engineer. She told the cameras she would not let them bury him again, not in paperwork or silence. She refused to let the city forget his face. Reporters pressed her for emotion, and she delivered it with raw edges, unashamed of the way her voice broke. She watched the coverage later alone in her living room, listening to the way anchors stumbled over the word apology. Denise woke before dawn and sat at the edge of her bed, feeling the weight of another day press against her shoulders. The air in the room was thick with late summer humidity, and the ceiling fan did little to move it. She looked at the framed photo of Marcus on her nightstand, his smile frozen in time forever, 16 forever, full of plans he would never get to keep. She traced the frame with her fingers, slowly and deliberately whispering his name like she had done every morning since he vanished. The house was silent except for the groan of the old pipes and the chirping of crickets outside the window. She felt the years stretch behind her, heavy and relentless, filled with days of waiting and nights of begging God to tell her where he was. She pushed herself to stand every joint protesting, but she had made promises to keep. The city had changed in small, cruel ways while Denise fought for answers. New buildings stood where old ones had collapsed, and fresh paint covered walls that once bore Marcus's face on fading posters. She drove through streets that no longer felt familiar, watching young men who reminded her of her son crossing intersections with their heads down and music in their ears. She felt an ache in her chest every time she saw them, imagining Marcus among them if he had been given the chance to grow. She parked in front of the police station and turned off the engine, letting her fingers rest on the steering wheel. She took a deep breath, held it until it hurt, then exhaled slowly. She picked up the thick file of her notes, the same one she had carried for years, its corners worn soft from handling. She opened the door and stepped out into the heavy morning heat. Inside the station, the air was artificially cool and smelled of old coffee and industrial cleaner. Officers moved about with practiced indifference, but a few recognized her and offered small nods or cautious greetings. Denise ignored them and went straight to the front desk. She asked to see the lead detective by name, her voice steady and measured. The young officer behind the desk blinked twice before picking up the phone. She watched him speak in low tones, tapping his pen against the counter. When he hung up, he told her to have a seat. She sat without argument, crossing her legs at the ankle and holding the file tight against her chest. She waited, with the patience of someone who had learned the value of time, who understood that waiting was a form of battle no one respected until it was too late. When the detective finally emerged from the back, he looked tired but resolute. He motioned her into a conference room with a table scarred by years of use and chairs that creaked when you shifted your weight. Denise sat carefully and placed her file in front of her. He thanked her for coming in and began to explain the results of the latest investigation. His words were deliberate, careful not to inflame or dismiss. They had identified 2 retired officers who matched the bus driver's description, men who had quietly left the force years ago without fanfare or scrutiny. The department was opening internal reviews into their records, and while charges might never come, their names would be made public. Denise listened without blinking, her face carved from stone. She felt both vindicated and furious. She wanted to scream at how long it had taken, how little it felt like justice. But she stayed quiet because Marcus deserved her focus, not her anger. The detective also told her about the warehouse district. The city planned to demolish the block, clear away the rotting buildings that had sheltered so many crimes for so many years. Denise imagined the walls falling under heavy machinery, the dust rising into the hot Atlanta sky, and she felt a flicker of satisfaction. But she also imagined Marcus there one last time alone, and terrified, his voice echoing off those walls while no one listened. She pressed her lips together to keep from sobbing. The detective said they were setting up a memorial plaque for victims whose cases had gone cold for too long. They wanted to include Marcus's name. Denise nodded slowly. She thought it was too little, but it was more than she had been offered for most of these years. Denise left the station with the sun beating down on her, the sky a hard, relentless blue. She walked slowly to her car, careful with her steps, feeling the heat radiate from the pavement through the soles of her shoes. She drove home in silence, the city rolling past her window like an old film. She saw mothers walking with their children, and felt both envy and relief for them. At a red light, she rested her forehead against the steering wheel, breathing slowly. She remembered Marcus in 100 tiny ways. His laugh that bubbled up and filled the whole house. The way he insisted on playing one last game of basketball even when it was too dark to see the hoop. The way he always hugged her even when he was angry. She let the light turn green and drove on. That evening, Denise changed clothes slowly and deliberately, choosing something simple and black. She stood in front of the mirror and pulled her hair back from her face. She looked older than she remembered, her eyes shadowed from too many nights of crying. She picked up the framed photo of Marcus from her nightstand and tucked it into her purse. She locked the door behind her and walked to the vigil planned at the old bus depot. The crowd was small but determined. Neighbors she had not spoken to in years nodded at her solemnly. She felt their pity like a weight, but accepted it because Marcus deserved to be remembered. She stood at the edge of the crowd until someone handed her a candle. She took it without speaking, watching the flame flicker in the evening breeze. When it was time for her to speak, she stepped forward carefully. She cleared her throat and looked at the crowd with tired, steady eyes. She talked about Marcus not as a victim, but as a boy who deserved more than this ending. She described his dreams of college, his love of basketball, his quick laugh. She told them about the years spent searching while the world turned away. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. She asked them to remember him, not just tonight, but every time they saw a boy walking home alone. She asked them to demand better from their city, from their police, from themselves. She finished with Marcus's name spoken clearly, refusing to let it fade. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel to support more content like this. We would love to hear your thoughts about the plot and how it made you feel. Share your opinions in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Your feedback helps us keep bringing these stories to life.